This is part 17, preparation for NSE4 exam, Fortinet. We are talking about ZTNA, FortiClient EMS, endpoint management system, and FortiGate. FortiClient and FortiClient EMS connectivity. FortiGate uses FortiClient EMS fabric connector to connect FortiGate and verify that FortiClient EMS. The FortiClient EMS server certificate needs to be installed by certificate CA, certificate authority on FortiGate, otherwise certificate is not trusted. FortiClient EMS must authorize the FortiGate as fabric device. On graphical user interface, we go to security fabric connectors, FortiGate GUI, administration fabric devices. FortiClient EMS graphical user interface provides fabric device authentication requests data and fabric connector status. Zero trust tagging rules. You can create, edit, and delete zero trust tagging rules for Windows, macOS, Linux, iOS, and Android endpoints. When using tagging rules with EMS and FortiClient, we go to graphical user interface, zero trust tags, zero trust tagging rules. EMS sends zero trust tagging rules to endpoints. FortiClient checks endpoints using the provided rules and sends the results to the EMS. EMS endpoint management system dynamically groups endpoints together using the tag configured on each rule. You can view the dynamic endpoint groups in Zero Trust tags, then go to Zero Trust tag monitor. FortiClient EMS certificate management. FortiClient EMS has a default root CA certificate. ZTNA CA uses root certificate to sign CSRs from the FortiClient endpoints. You can revoke and update the root CA certificate authority. You can force updates to the FortiGate and to FortiClient endpoints by generating new certificates for each client. FortiClient EMS manages individual client certificates. Do not confuse EMS CA certificate ZTNA with SSL certificate. We go to System Settings, EMS settings. On Windows endpoints, FortiClient EMS automatically installs certificates in the certificate store. Certificate information, for example, certificate user ID and serial number, should match the information on FortiClient EMS and on FortiGate. As for other, go to vendor information. Certificates, then go to Personal, then choose Certificates. You can also verify that using command line interface. Command: diagnose endpoint record list, and then enter optional IP address. SSL certificate-based authentication. An endpoint obtains a client certificate when FortiGate registers to FortiClient EMS. FortiClient automatically submits CSR request. FortiClient EMS signs and returns the client certificate. The certificate is stored in Operating System Certificate Store. By default, client certificate authentication is enabled on Access Proxy. By default, empty certificate response is set to block, and by default options can be configured in command line interface only. To configure that SSL certificate-based authentication options, go to CLI and type config firewall access proxy, edit, set client set certificate, client-cert enable, set empty-cert-action block, end. Currently, ZTNA supports the Microsoft Edge and Google Chrome browsers. ZTNA HTTPS access proxy. HTTPS access proxy works as a reverse proxy. Reverse proxy and verifies user identity, device identity, and trust context before granting access. To deploy ZTNA, you need the following: FortiClient endpoint, optionally HTTP access proxy, FortiClient EMS, FortiGate, FortiGate to FortiClient EMS connector, FortiGate to ZTNA server, FortiGate to ZTNA rule, and the option authentication explicit proxy enable. ZTNA supports basic HTTP and SAML methods. ZTNA server, using graphical user interface, choose policy objects, then ZTNA, then ZTNA servers. There you can create a new, put external IP, virtual host matching rules, real IP server address and port, and real server IP address and port. ZTNA rule. Go to Policy and Objects, ZTNA, ZTNA rules. Here you can create new ZTNA rules. UTM processing of the traffic happens at the ZTNA rule. When you create new, denying access are based on malicious tag. Action. You can choose either accept or deny. Then put name of the rule, ZTNA server name as destination, and log violation traffic. FortiClient EMS certificate management. Using CLI command, diagnose endpoint record list, and then you can optionally put IP address. Note that UTM processing of the traffic happens at the ZTNA route. ZTNA HTTPS access proxy with basic authentication. You can add authentication to the access proxy. It requires authentication scheme and authentication rule. To authenticate proxy-based policies, you can use LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, Radius server, or local database or other supported user servers. Each method, HTTP or SAML, has additional settings to define the data source. For example, with HTTP authentication, user database can reference an LDAP server, Radius server, or local database supported for authentication servers that is the user authenticated against. ZTNA supports the active authentication method. The active authentication method references a scheme where users are actively prompted for authentication, as they are with basic authentication. After the authentication rule triggers the method to authenticate the user, a successful authentication returns the group that the user belongs to. ZTNA TCP Forwarding Access Proxy. TFAP TCP Forwarding Access Proxy is configured to demonstrate an HTTPS reverse proxy that forwards TCP traffic to the resource. So TFAP is an abbreviation which means TCP Forwarding Access Proxy. TCP is Transport Control Protocol. TFAP tunnels traffic between the client and FortiGate over HTTPS. TFAP TCP Forwarding Access Proxy forwards the TCP traffic to the protected resource. ZTNA SSH Access Proxy. ZTNA supports SSH Access Proxy to provide seamless SSH connection. Advantages over TCP Forwarding Access Proxy are: there are at least 4 advantages, and first of them is establishing device trust context with user identity and device identity checks. Second, why ZTNA SSH Access Proxy is better than TFAP is applying SSH deep inspection to the traffic through the SSH related profile. 3. Performing optional, or sometimes it's must, SSH host key validation of the server. And a fourth advantage of ZTNA SSH Access Proxy over TFAP, TCP Forwarding Access Proxy, is that using one-time user authentication to authenticate ZTNA, SSH access proxy connection, and SSH server connection. To act as a reverse proxy for SSH server, FortiGate must perform SSH host key validation to verify the identity of SSH server. FortiGate stores the public SSH key of the SSH server in its SSH host key configurations. Thank you.